Hello, everybody. This is John with another installment of Think Culture. And today's episode is going to be sort of heavy, but I think it actually addresses some questions and some issues that are absolutely critical for anyone who wants to think seriously about politics to engage with. And I'll also be making the argument that Foucault should not be rejected by the right, that the right is wrong to not engage with Foucault, and that his appropriation by the left is basically a misappropriation. I'll be dealing with an essay, specifically, that essay being Nancy Fraser's Foucault, a Young Conservative. Nancy, like many of the people I talk about on my channel, is a thinker of the left, but has nevertheless exerted some influence on my thought. I think she tends to be a good, clear writer, sort of uniquely honest. The title of the essay is an allusion to Jürgen Habermas, who has really been the central figure of the Frankfurt School for the last several decades, referring to Foucault as just that, a young conservative. With this label, he means to sort of dismiss Foucault as irrelevant for the left by associating his thought with the conservative revolution in Germany. For our purposes here, primarily he's associating him with Heidegger. Habermas sees the critical theory tradition that he belongs to, that the Frankfurt School belongs to, as one of dialectical social criticism, beginning with Marx, that understands the Enlightenment and modernization as a two-sided process. And it aims to preserve the good emancipatory dimension of this Enlightenment and modernization, while criticizing it for the negative features. On the other hand, he accuses the other tradition of thinkers, Nietzsche, Foucault, Heidegger, post-structuralism in general, as engaged in what he calls a rejectionist criticism of modernity, aspiring to a total break with the Enlightenment. He says that they turn critique even against itself and criticize the very constitutive norms of modernity, rejecting even its alleged commitments to truth, rationality, and freedom. Frankly, I think that he is clearly and completely correct about all of that. Left-wing politics are inextricably bound to the tradition of Enlightenment humanism, and to reject that tradition thus means to belong instead to the tradition of the counter-Enlightenment and of reaction. Foucault is therefore actually a figure essentially opposed to the political left, rather than a figure whose thought belongs to it. The appropriation of his thought today on the left is generally a matter of partisan revisionism and deliberate misinterpretation. And there's also what Nancy Fraser does, for example, in this essay. She's trying in this essay to basically find some way to save Foucault for the left, or if the accusation leveled by, or find out if the accusation leveled by Habermas is simply unavoidably correct. The question then really being for her and for Habermas, the question of whether or not Foucault should be dismissed. And the way she wants to consider this is a little difficult to keep track of here, despite how organized and clear and structured the essay is. The reason for that is she's really trying to wiggle her way out of it, and also we're talking about her interpretation of Habermas's interpretation of various interpretations of Foucault. But I'm going to try to make it clear, pretty clear as I go through the essay. So she starts in it by saying that we need to break the charge that Foucault's work constitutes a total rejection of humanism down into three separate claims: philosophical rejection, strategic rejection, and normative rejection. And strategic rejection of humanism would mean that humanist political rhetoric is at best ineffective. At worst, and we'll see that this is basically Foucault's position actually, that he thinks that strategic humanism is part and parcel with the modern form of domination. A normative rejection of humanism would mean that the humanist ideals even that we're trying to achieve and by which we evaluate whether or not something is good or bad, in this case, ideals like freedom, autonomy, rationality, that these are themselves either not useful or, again, counterproductive. And finally, the philosophical or conceptual rejection of humanism would mean that humanism is based on a rotten conceptual foundation to begin with, that its fundamental concepts are empty or incoherent, that a philosophical investigation into the foundations of humanism would reveal it to be empty or misguided. The structure of the essay is introduction, then philosophical rejectionism, then strategic rejectionism, and then normative rejectionism, and then the conclusion. So I'm going to run through these three middle sections one by one, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, and I'm going to explain what's in them, as well as offering my own comments here and there. The first section is philosophical rejectionism. Now, to me, this is the only one that really matters. In my mind, if humanism is philosophically rejected, that's it for humanism. This is the fundamental question for political thought, right here, that I think the essay really provokes us to think about, although it isn't really her intention. The question being, do you think that philosophy ought to have primacy for our political thinking and for our political action? Or do you think that, say, norms should have primacy instead, as Nancy Fraser seems to think? This is a critical decision, and for me, philosophy has primacy. So if humanist norms are grounded in a philosophical foundation that I oppose, then to me that simply necessitates a rejection of the norms as well, or at least a bracketing of them, subjecting them to criticism, etc. In any case, Nancy Fraser doesn't explicitly address it, but she also obviously does not answer the question in the same way that I do. And consequently, she seems to treat philosophical rejectionism as even the most inessential form. She also seems to be to buy completely the idea that he is a philosophical rejectionist, which again in my mind should be the end of the story. The topic for this section, however, isn't is he a philosophical rejectionist, it's is he merely a philosophical rejectionist? Can we say that it stops there? So that's the question she's considering. Her take is that, so he is a philosophical rejectionist. He's following Heidegger in completing and concretizing his program for the dismantling of Cartesianism. He sees Cartesianism and subject-object metaphysics as both the root of our disciplinary regime and also as being a sort of contingent historical phenomenon rather than expressing any sort of trans-historical truth about the ultimate nature of human beings. He thinks man, as we understand him, only really emerges in the 18th century with the new disciplinary regime. In this regime, man emerges as an epistemic object, the target and focus of medical, psychiatric, sociological, criminological discourses that sort of define his contours and really create him. The subject-object metaphysics makes it possible. Man gets viewed alternately as a subject, that is, as master with his own desires, as free and autonomous, as rational, etc., and as an object, as subject to prediction and control, as something to be mastered, as caught up in the processes of cause and effect, as manipulable. Humanism aims to let the subject pole dominate. But Foucault thinks that this is impossible and misguided, that Cartesianism as a whole has to be rejected. There is no way to only have the subject. Even more, while his early works, like Discipline and Punish, seem to deal primarily with man's objectification, his later works really also show how processes of subjectification are at least equally problematic, and ultimately also operate as a form of domination and social control. This line of thought actually I think goes well with the topic of my last video, Zygmunt Bauman's Liquid Modernity. But in any case, she says of these later works, quote, although Foucault never explicitly clarified the intention of them, it is safe to assume that it is not a humanist one, and on the contrary, that his intention must be, in fact, anti-humanist. She's correct about that, but remember, she's asking only whether he can be viewed merely as a philosophical rejectionist. To view him as just sort of de-Cartesianizing humanism, but ultimately from within the humanist tradition. That his rejection of the subject-object framework, his rejection of progress, of universality, etc., is an attempt to remove what is counterproductive or useless within humanism, while nevertheless somehow retaining the substantial critical core, which again, she thinks is the normative elements. So she thinks it's desirable and maybe possible to interpret him this way, but she says since his work doesn't seem to provide good answers to important questions like what sort of change is possible and desirable, what forms of resistance are acceptable, etc., that his work, and I quote again, tends to, as a result, invite the assumption that in Foucault's work one is dealing with the rejectionism of a stronger sort. Again, I would say, yeah, that's obviously the case because philosophical rejectionism necessitates strategic and normative rejectionism, but in any case, So she's hedging here. And when we go to section 2, she's basically asking, is he combining philosophical rejection with only strategic rejection? Or does it extend even beyond that? The main book here that she's considering is Discipline and Punish. In it, he argues that in the pre-modern era, humanist rhetoric was successfully deployed against monarchical absolutism, torture, execution, etc., but that this success did not mean an end to domination, but only transformed it, humanized it, if you will, so that now the enemy is less the law, despots, the police, etc., but is in fact the psychiatrist, the social scientist, the professor. I would add, obviously, that isn't it interesting that these enemies are all basically left-wing. But anyway, the earlier regime targeted actions, bodies. The new target is the soul. Rather than being whipped or having a hand chopped off, you're thrown into a prison and rehabilitated. You get pushed through the school system that molds you into an adult. You get a guidance counselor who helps you figure out what you want to do with your life. You get a therapist to work through your problems. You get a daily routine scheduled to go around the clock, etc. The target of all this is man himself, who he is. It's about reprogramming people and about producing good subjects rather than punishing them. Social science discovers what motivates people, and they ensure that you're properly motivated. Decides that criminality is a consequence of low self-esteem, and it works to boost your ego. It finds all the explanations and mechanisms underneath the naughty behaviors and finds out what the proper prescriptions then are for softly transforming them. All the hardness and harshness of the prior regime of punishment in the juridical order is gone. People are granted freedom. They're helped and pushed to self-actualize, to climb the ladder of success. And yet for all this humanization of domination, Foucault points out that this is actually a greater social control. The normalizing disciplinary power that works to construct and produce human subjects is in some sense stronger than the previous juridical order that only sought to punish the guilty. Consequently, these humanist ideas of subjectivity, autonomy, selfhood, etc., this rhetoric that motivated a lot of these discourses and a lot of this change in our practices, one, did not save us, and two, come to constitute an integral component of the disciplinary regime, part of the technologies of reconditioning. Now, the way she tries to rein this back in is she says that then the interpretation of Foucault as a strategic rejectionist is largely based on only one extended historical example, in Discipline and Punish. So that generalizing this insight to every other area, assuming that all our institutions function in this way, she thinks is ultimately unwarranted. I'd like to point out again, however, that in my view, Foucault does not need to do more than this and spell out a specific strategic rejectionism because the philosophical rejectionism already entails it. But anyway, in addition, she claims that there's an ambiguity about what the target of disciplinary power is. Whether it's the self conceived of as a seat of representations, or the self conceived of as free and rational self-determination. As in, does discipline work by turning us into reflective subjects of self-transformation and self-guidance and self-control? Or does it change the way that we see and understand certain things, certain concepts, but then ultimately leave intact our ability to freely decide? Thinking of these as separate, as she does, again allows her some wiggle room to try to say, maybe we can interpret him as possibly not being a strategic rejectionist. But in my mind, she has again separated artificially what belongs together. This is actually a broader issue. For example, Judith Butler's performativity, I think, has the same issue, and I will address that and Butler actually in a later video. But suffice it to say for now that for Foucault, for myself, there is no stable, essential, underlying, free and rational core of the subject. And again, we can see that from the philosophical rejectionism. Subjects are produced from out of discursive practices. There is no desire underlying our representations and then operating on them. Desire is itself already a product. But, she says, because of this, her ambiguating these things, quote, one need not conclude with Foucault that humanist ideals must be rejected on strategic grounds. But we can instead go along with Habermas and say that a precondition for their realization is that the power structuring discourse must be symmetrical, non-hierarchical, and reciprocal. So finally we come to the third section, the normative axis. For her, the all-important one. The question for her here is, okay, so even if Foucault abandons the conceptual foundations of humanism, and even if he does think that humanist political rhetoric and tactics are counterproductive, would it then still be at least possible for us to interpret him as not rejecting humanism on a normative basis? But we also understand him, must we also understand him as rejecting the notion that we ought to strive for a free and equal society of autonomous, rational individuals? She says that people who adopt this interpretation of Foucault as a normative rejectionist, people like Paul Rabinow, Bert Dreyfus, and of course myself, think that the normative conception of freedom as autonomy is already a formula for domination. She says this reading relies on later work, like the history of sexuality and truth and subjectivity, work that focuses on the subjectifying practices aimed at self-mastery via uncovering the previously hidden, the previously unthematized, criticizing the formerly uncriticized parts of the self, unlocking previously unarticulated desires, thoughts, wishes, needs. He provides a genealogical account in this way of the fabrication of the hermeneutical subject, and in so doing shows that the production of subjectivity seals the fate of our domination. The quintessential humanist forms of discourse concerning our liberation and self-mastery are subjectifying, giving over to the kind of endless project of self-mastery and self-discipline that, again, we talked about in the Bauman video. For Foucault, too, all of this is ultimately immiserating, not liberating. It leads in the direction of panopticism, where normalizing power is omnipresent and inescapable. In this reading, she says, we can even imagine a perfected disciplinary regime in which normalizing power has become so omnipresent, so finely tuned, so penetrating, so interiorized and subjectified, therefore becoming invisible, that there will no longer be any need for instruments, agents, or institutions of domination. In the fully panopticized society, we all surveil and discipline ourselves. Does that sound familiar to you? It certainly does for me. The disciplinary norms in this world thus become so internalized that we don't even perceive them as coming from outside of us. Therefore, in this imaginary world, I would say not really imaginary, but a future we're rapidly creating, the ideal situation for Habermas and the humanists is actually realized, and yet it's very far from a good thing. The ideals of humanism, autonomy, reciprocity, self-exploration, and development are clearly seen here as being the very goals of disciplinary power. She admits that a counter to this argument, like, well, an internalized other is still other, and so we can't really say autonomy has been achieved, would be very difficult to back up. I would say again that it would be impossible to back up, and it would indicate that you're still operating within a humanist and therefore Cartesian framework. But instead, she turns to this bombshell claim. She says, quote, but what if in response, the humanist simply digs in and says, if that's what disciplinary society means, I'm for it. She claims that this counter would shift the burden back onto Foucault to explain why disciplinary society is bad, and that he wouldn't be able to answer the question very well without appeal to some kind of humanist or meta-humanist ethical paradigm. She admits that he never has elaborated such a paradigm, of course, because he doesn't need to. But I just want to stop here for a second and let's pay attention to what she said. She said, what if the humanist, her, doing a counter-argument, digs in and says, if that is what discipline is, I'm for it. To me, I think there's the rub. This is a big, that's sort of the crux of the issue here. The reason that the masters of disciplinary society, as we saw, as Foucault says, are the social scientists, psychologists, social workers, etc., all of whom are humanists and grounded in humanist discourse, is because humanism and disciplinarity cannot be separated. And that is, of course, Foucault's point. Yes, Nancy Fraser, you ultimately will have to dig your heels in and admit your support for the disciplinary regime. You're part of its ruling class. You can't save humanism, and therefore you can't save the left without in fact working actively on behalf of the current regime. Okay, so that was long, hopefully not too dry and boring. I think it's really important, and there are a lot of important issues that we addressed there, especially this question of, do you allow philosophy to have primacy? It also demonstrates, I think, this relationship between the left and humanism and the disciplinary regime. It shows their status as part of the ruling class, I think. And I'm also making the point, trying to, that Foucault is a conservative. In any case, I worked hard to make this sort of a manageable size and sufficiently entertaining, but this is just, a pretty theoretical video. I'm going to take a break from doing the theory videos, for a little bit, and do at least a few videos that are a little more laid back, doing social commentary, cultural commentary, whatever, maybe talk about the news for at least the next few videos. I think before doing some theory stuff again, but I thought that this was a really crucial topic and essay to discuss, so I wanted to go ahead and do it. Thanks for watching. Please leave any questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you and talk. As always, don't simply react, but think culture.